Today I'm going to be taking a look at a 1970 Beetle that's got charging issues. The battery's been going flat over the last few weeks, so we're going to run through the charging system and see what we can find. So let's check it out. So the first thing I noticed was when I started the engine, the generator light on the dashboard didn't extinguish, it stayed on. And even when I revved it, it still stayed on. This car should have had a dynamo from factory, but has been upgraded to an alternator. So the first thing I'm going to do is check our charge light wire from the alternator back to the dashboard, make sure that works correctly. So I'm going to disconnect our charge light wire, which is this one here, put our ignition on, and then put it to earth onto the alternator body and make sure that the light switches on and off at the dashboard end. With the ignition switched on, I can now test our generator wire. So if I put this to earth of the body of the alternator, it should switch the light on the dashboard and off when I remove it and on again. So this tells me that our line is good from here all the way up to the dashboard to the bulb, and that side of it's working correctly. With my voltmeter and the engine running, I can now test the output of our alternator. Although the output from the alternator initially looked quite good, as soon as I loaded the circuit up by putting the headlights on, you can see that the charge rate fell away quite quickly. So we know for sure that this hasn't been charging whilst driving. There are two more tests I need to do before I condemn the alternator, and that's check the volt drop across the positive side of our alternator circuit and across the negative side of our alternator circuit. And I'm going to do that with my voltmeter. I've connected my multimeter from the positive terminal of the battery to the positive terminal of the alternator. Then I'm going to run the engine and put the headlights on and load the circuit up. And I'm going to see if we get any voltage drop across that circuit. I'm now going to carry out the same volt drop test for the negative side of the circuit. So that's from the negative terminal of the battery to the body of the alternator. Headlights on. So both volt drop checks tested out okay, so that confirms it's our alternator. So we need to remove and replace the alternator. Generally, replacing an alternator on a VW Beetle would be an engine out job, but I'm going to show you how to do it in situ. So the first thing we need to do is undo the 36mm nut on the back of the fan housing. And we get down there with our deep rich 36mm and a medium-sized knuckle bar. And then we need to hold the front of the alternator pulley with the correct tool. So we take our 36mm and our knuckle bar, we're going to put that down behind the fan housing. We put it on the nut at the back of the alternator, like so. Take our special tool, so this actually sits onto the pulley, and then we can get good leverage and actually stop the pulley moving. Don't be tempted to put a screwdriver in here because you will just damage the edge and then you won't be able to undo it. This tool does both 6 volt and 12 volt, so it's a must if you're an air-cooled VW owner. I can hold the pulley in place while I undo the nut on the back of the alternator. It's quite tight, but it does go. Good, that's it moved. Now I can put the ratchet in there, it's a bit shorter. Now I've cracked it off and then we can undo our nut on the back. So the first thing we take off is the nut. There's also shims and washers on there, so we must be careful that we take them off and put them back in the right order. So using a 21mm socket in our knuckle bar, and again our fan pulley holding tool, we can hold that nice and tight, and I can undo the front. There we go. Remove this 21mm nut, and again we have to be careful because we've got shims and a washer here. We don't want to drop those and lose those. Again, important to remember what sequence they come off of so we can put it back how it was, unless we're putting a new belt back, obviously. Next we can remove the air filter, so there's one screw under here on the clamp. And then the other screw over here on the ducting. So, I'm going to pop a little bit of tape over the top of the carburettor just so we don't drop anything inside it or get any dirt in there. Just going to move the wiring out of the way. Obviously be very gentle and careful. It's quite old, the wiring, we don't want to start breaking it. Okay. Next I'm just going to pop the HT leads out of their clips off of the fan housing, so that's out of the way. That one there. And those two there. So the next part, which is quite tricky, is to remove the fan housing bolt. So there's 4 bolts that hold the alternator to the fan housing, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. As long as they're actual bolt heads, as in 10mm bolt heads, you can access those. And there's obviously a bolt either side on the fan housing too, so we can loosen the fan housing and the clamp that goes around the alternator and the pedestal. And then we can get that all moving and we should be able to withdraw our alternator. So I'll get that done. To gain access to our last bolt, which holds our fan housing together, I'm going to remove the carburettor, and that'll give us enough room to get down the back. We can now gently wiggle the carburettor off. Off he comes. That's good. And it hasn't actually torn the gasket either, so that's good news. So now I can access that last bolt, which is down the back here, a little bit tricky. Obviously with our car off, it's much easier. That's got him loose. Before we go too far, I'm just going to put a bit of tape over our inlet manifold, so again we don't drop anything down there. Tape across there, because the last thing I want to do is drop that bolt that I'm removing straight down the inlet manifold. And if I don't cover it up, it will happen. So let's see if I can finger that out yet. Not quite. So now with our last bolt out at the bottom, I should be able to wiggle our alternator out. So we've got our fan housing that's loose, and obviously the cowling part is undone. And gently pull it back. Also, we need to remember that we need to pull off the actual fan from the other side that we unbolted. So I'm going to lift that off. Oh, and there we go. So now I'll just gently lift that out. Watch the wiring. And there we go. Still with our shims this side as well. So obviously be careful when you remove, because we've got shims go there between that and the fan. The fan stays in there now. And then we can fit our new alternator to our fan cover here and refit it. So we've got our old unit here. I'm going to remove the drive flange off the back. As you see, I've got a 3-legged puller here that I'm just literally using my fingers actually to turn the puller to pull it off. It's on a straight shaft with a woodruff key, so fairly easy as long as it's not corroded on there. That's good. Pull the rest of that off. Yep. So we need to swap that over onto our new unit. Check that the space is the same and take the woodruff key out also. So with my little toffee hammer and a small screwdriver, I should be able to just tap that woodruff key out, like so. Good. I need to do the same on the front as well. Again, make sure we can get that woodruff key out here. Both of those out. Off with the spacer, and then we just check the spacers on the new unit we've got and make sure that they're the same depth. Yeah, you. With our woodruff key in position, we're going to slide on our drive flange. Like so, lovely. And then we just need to put our spacer and woodruff key on the other side. So we pop our original spacer back on and then put our little woodruff key in ready to put the belt drive back on. That's it. So before I put the new unit back on, I've got our flats located on the fan horizontal and the same on the actual drive flange. But also I need to remember to put on our original shims, so I'm going to do that now. So our original shims are going to go on. We may need to change this, but we're going to start where we left off. Bolt it all up together and make sure that our fan doesn't touch our fan housing. So that's our 3 shims on. We should be able to slide that gently into position. So the bottom goes in first And then I'm going to have to lift the fan onto the alternator from the other side. So our new alternator is bolted on to the fan housing with its 4 bolts, the 2 at the top and the 2 at the bottom. It's resting on the pedestal. Also, I've put the fan on the back and I've put the fan nut on the back to secure it. Put the front pulley on so I could tighten the rear fan nut up, which I've done. And at this point, we just want to make sure that when we spin our alternator, our fan doesn't touch our fan housing. So let's try that. Beautiful. So we've got our clearance. We've used our original shimming and it's worked out right. If you are replacing your alternator and you find that you're just starting to scuff the fan housing, you might want to add a shim or take a shim off. So at this point you'd need to take it off and do that again. But we can forge ahead now and get the whole thing back together. So just about to refit the carburettor. This gasket on the bottom of the base of the carburettor came off clean and good and hadn't broken away from the carburettor, so I'm happy to put that back on. I've just put a little tiny bit of grease on the surface just to help settle it back in. If you did damage your gasket, obviously make sure you change that gasket. The last thing you want to be doing is drawing air between the inlet manifold and the carburettor, because it will not run right at all. So let's get our carburettor back in place. We can get that all bolted up. So there we have it. There's how to replace an alternator on a 1970 Beetle without taking the engine out. For more hints and tips, follow us on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to check us out at justkampers.com. Thanks for watching.